Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, Bruchim Abim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You found Beit, Virtuali, and a Haftarah Coffee Break. There is a fascinating linguistic issue at the core of the secular versus religious divide in Israel. Sure, this dati-chiluni societal bifurcation is quite complicated with complex historical factors that do need to be considered. And yet, from within this complication, one comment that I have heard multiple variations of from secular Israeli friends when we discuss religion, which is always interesting, appears as a variation of,
when I read the Siddur, it is written in my language, my words. I understand these words, but do not agree with them all. So how am I supposed to say them in prayer?
As a non-native Hebrew speaker, and quite frankly, one who is much more comfortable translating ancient texts than ordering shawarma on the street, I can try to understand this, but must admit I will never really get it. I can translate the Siddur, Jewish prayer book, pretty well on the fly when necessary, thank you very much, but that's just it. I'm translating. Second languages, or third or fourth, are not even processed in the same part of the brain as our native tongues. When I, as a US American native speaker, say that something is motherhood and apple pie, it's not just an expression, it's a doorway into all the memories and associations that make motherhood and apple pie into, well, motherhood and apple pie. When an Israeli Jew opens a Siddur, yes, the version of Hebrew written within contains 3,000 years of evolving language, so it's not the same thing that's spoken on the street when you order a shawarma, but a word that has translated academic meaning to me will have intrinsic life associations for the Israeli Jew. So it's all fine and dandy for me, as I've done countless times, with probably a little bit more than just a little hubris, to explain rabbinically and sagely that the best pathway through the prayer book comes via the gates of symbolic and metaphoric understandings of the text. That is easy to say as a non-native speaker. Without understanding the wordless connections that each concept and letter spark in the brain of a native Hebrew speaker, my efficacy as a guide will always be limited. Still, this morning while laying tefillin and praying solo shacharit while looking out the window at a brisk, cool Baltic Sea morning, perhaps current events and a moment of letting the words of the prayer make deep internal connections gave me a twinkle of insight and compassion regarding this linguistic challenge. But I'm going to have to take us on a bit of a journey for this moment to make any sense. You see, I hate miracles, or at least I hate a certain literary or religious presentation of miracles. And in Judaism, I don't think I'm alone. The greatest stories of miracles in the Exodus narrative did not lead to the sorts of transformations that we would imagine they would lead had they happened to us. We, today, reading these texts, look at the parting of the Sea of Reeds or the 10 plagues, and most of us think, and let's be honest, if you're a Christian listening to this video, this includes most members of our younger sister religion as well, we think something like,
if I had been there and seen the plagues, I wouldn't and couldn't ever have a crisis of faith.
This comes as we read mere verses after the escape from Pharaoh's army that the grumbling immediately began. And I quote, "If only we had died by the hand of the Eternal in the land of Egypt, when we sat by our flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread. For you brought us out into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death." I've watched it happen in synagogues and, more extremely, in guest teaching spots and interfaith gatherings. Not only the thoughts on the expressions of people, but the outright expression of,
how could the Israelites be so ungrateful?
The answers to that question are easy, obvious, and perhaps dangerous. In many holy books from many different traditions, characters behave in saintly or perfect ways. In the Tanakh, humanity with all its warts is explored. In a story where there are no human weaknesses, there are no notches in which we can stick out fingers and slowly climb through our personal challenges. When we see characters in the Tanakh acting horribly, which they often do in the same way that the rest of us mortals do, we can relate to the bad behavior even if out loud or even consciously we're unable to admit it. But because of how the Tanakh is presented, the existing ideas about Jews that have been locked behind institutional prejudice against Judaism since time immemorial are reinforced by that kind of reading of the text. It's not that we're excited that the text is realistic and human, it's how could the Israelites read Jews be so ungrateful. Just specifically look at this moment of grumbling, or what in Yiddish we refer to as kvetching, and the rest of us non-Yiddish speakers call Monday, or Tuesday, as well as when you get it. This particular incident in the book of Exodus takes place 2.5 months after the departure from Egypt. It's right there in the text and requires no interpretation, just reading. And the so-called wilderness that the Torah is so fond of naming the land of these travels is something that we would refer to as desert. To be blunt, I don't care if we all just collectively saw every angel of heaven appear in the sky for the most literal rousing chorus of Adon Olam we have ever experienced, with a coda that says, "I shall always be with you and never forsake you." A mere, let's say, 3 days later, after such a visible and incontrovertible miracle, and that 3 days is being generous, without a steady supply of food and water, our grumbling would start, and probably not stop. We who have never experienced actual starvation, nor the potential of it in the way that most of humanity for the whole of history have experienced it, would do well to take a step back in judgment. Yes, according to the Torah text, they had been camped for some time by a water source, and this grumbling verse comes after they've left this water source. But, in addition to that, the only food up to that point had been what had been hastily gathered 10 weeks earlier. Try eating matzah for 10 weeks, and one can assume it's going to run out at some point. We have no idea what this is like. And in Judaism, in the Western world, the only ones that can tell us are either those that survived the Holocaust or served in hellholes in World War II, like in the Ardennes Forest or in Peleliu. The nature of yesterday's miracle is meaningless when for weeks we have had nothing to eat. And although we can understand these words, essentially none of us in the Western world in the 21st century can truly relate to them. Which is why I believe the miracles in the Exodus narrative slowly give way to much more tangibly grounded narratives, with a few notable exceptions for the rest of the Torah and even the Tanakh. Yes, we do have the odd sun standing still in Joshua, but that, for example, is incredibly easy to understand as the relativity of time that we all experience. Or does the 5 minutes waiting for the text back from the person that you've just fallen in love with not feel like 3.5 days? Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, famous commentator in the 1800s, also known as the Netziv, peels this back beautifully when he explains that the ancient Israelites did not wish to exist solely on the basis of miracles, as we would then be required to live up to them. Better that we entered the promised land on the merit of our hands, and live to be judged by the work of our hands, than to be delivered miraculously and be required to act miraculously. So one Jewish source that truly gets this right is the recent American Reform prayer book, the Mishkan Tefillah, or the Sacred Tent of Prayer. Every morning, in every prayer book of every stream of Judaism, there's a series of brief blessings in the earliest part of the morning prayers, known usually as the Birkat HaShachar, or the Blessing of the Morning. Yes, it's also the title of the entire section of the prayer book, but hey, we try to make things as complicated as possible in Judaism. So within all these blessings, with the exception of 3 particular ones that are phrased in traditional prayer books as "thank you for not making me," the usual difference between these pithy statements is the order in which they're presented. Among this series of blessings are included, "Blessed are you, eternal sovereign of the universe, who clothes the naked," or "who helps me distinguish between day and night." And for those of us who rely on coffee, we pray especially passionately for "one who restores vigor to the weary." In most traditional prayer books, this section is either not specifically labeled or it's appropriately called Birkat HaShachar. In other prayer books like the Masorti Sim Shalom, the heading is a guide to intentionality. In this case, written above these blessings as a heading, we read, "We are grateful for the renewal of each day." You don't say that in prayer, but it helps you understand what you're praying. But the Mishkan Tefillah gives it what I think is the correct splendor, specifically labeling the section Nisim B'chol Yom, or our daily miracles. Mixed into these 15-ish blessings are the mundane and aspirational. Among these is the one that stopped my prayer this morning. If you are watching this video far in the future, what I'm about to say will not make as much sense as it does to the people watching a few weeks after October 7th, 2023. And the particular blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, Matir Asurim. In the Mishkan Tefillah's translation, "Praise to you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who frees the captives." Can't tell you how many times I've read this blessing, how many times I've looked at it, how many times I've even thought about the words. I know what the words mean, but it's not my native language. Until a few weeks ago, the underlying concept was as well not a native concept. On a literal level, I've never been a captive, other than to my own negative inclinations, which has been bad enough. The literal meaning of the words was barely more than academic. At best, they were part of the swift flow of the Hebrew words, mixed with the specific melody for the part of the prayer book that, for me, personally helps me to create a cloud of meditative focus. The words have had a deep meaning to me as a prayerful pathway and as part of the historical dialogue that makes the Jewish prayer book such a theological and spiritual powerhouse. But, I've never been a captive, nor had anyone else that I directly knew. I didn't need to stop in painful silence at this bracha. I only needed to add it to the necessary litany required for fulfilling daily prayer obligations. The words were always beautiful and aspirational. They were never terrible. Other than the obvious, the reason that this becomes so prominent this moment probably as well has something to do with spending now weeks chewing over how a rabbi who dislikes the concept of a miracle could possibly deal with the theme of the Haftarah for Parshat Vayera. What we read for the Haftarah from chapter 4 of 2 Kings tells of some of the miracle stories of the prophet Elisha, or Elisha. Most people love this part of 2 Kings. I don't. So now a deep breath. 2 paragraphs of critical textual and historical perspective regarding this text are about to come. Okay, good, it's important. All right, the foundational narrative texts of Samuel and Kings were written in the court of Josiah in the 7th century BCE, while Elisha served as a prophet and successor to Elijah, Eliyahu, 2 full centuries earlier. So, sorry, fundamentalist readings of these texts. These are not eyewitness accounts. They are quasi-polemic and quasi-establishment texts for the institutionalized version of Judaism that were being codified in the court of Josiah. Elisha's service marks the end of the dreaded, from Judah's perspective, rule of the house of Ahab and the continuation of the northern kingdom of Israel through such maligned figures as Yehu, Jehoahaz, and Joash. Everyday conversation names over the dinner table. According to the texts written by the southern kingdom, pretty much everything that the north did was awful, certainly against the rules of the Eternal, as specifically understood by the southern kingdom of Judah. Every prophet of the Eternal sent to the northern kingdom had one primary job, to tell them how awful they were and what would result from said awfulness. And of course, because Kings, as a biblical text, was written a few centuries later than the stories contained in this narrative, these prophets had uncanny abilities to see the future clearly. This week's Haftarah, however, deals a different game, essentially the same one that Moses played with Pharaoh's magicians. In Egypt, the game was, "My God is bigger than your gods," while with Elisha it is, "Look at the might and power from a true prophet of the Eternal." That would, by the way, be the Eternal as understood by the court of Josiah. I know this sounds cynical, but it's really just the inner workings of the factory where the kosher sausage is made, and no one wants to see that, and we become uncomfortable when it's forced upon us. So, sorry, not sorry. Yet the stories are fan favorites, and also prototypical for some of the miracle narratives written in the Christian Bible. Indeed, Elisha proved fan favorite enough that in addition to the Tanakh, he is mentioned by name in the Christian Bible, in the Quran, and in the text of the Baha'i movement. In the case of chapter 4, Elisha starts with the miracle of helping a poor woman out of poverty by magically filling every container that she and her son could find with oil that she could then sell. Directly after in the narrative, he prophesies the birth of a child to an old couple who are childless, which also acts as the connection between Parshat Vayera and this passage of Haftarah via the Abraham-Sarah narrative. The passage concludes with the death of the same child several years later and their subsequent resurrection by Elisha. And see, the issue is, I can't live up to that. And neither can you. The Netziv was right, because we truly want and need to only be judged by what's normatively humanly possible. Put differently, if such miracles are possible, why can't I perform them? More depressingly, why don't I see them? Because a miracle or two would sure be nice right about now. And this is where the Mishkan Tefillah becomes a guide for us and gets it so right. By calling the Birkat HaShachar our daily miracles, we have an attempt to reset ourselves regarding the actual nature of a miracle and rewire ourselves regarding our place in them, in addition to God's place in them, if you will. And I think by understanding this passage as our daily miracles, it can help me to understand how we can pray to a God who frees the captives when this moment there are so many, and there's so many who aren't being freed. So to figure this out, let's look at a different blessing. Let's take who clothes the naked. It's not meant to be taken literally, but there are 2 paths that we can take while understanding it symbolically. At a less tangible level, the Jewish concept of deity is that which covers, like spiritual clothing, the parts of ourselves that are most vulnerable. At the loss of a loved one, for example, nothing is adequate, including ritual traditions. Nothing is adequate. But having a daily prayer or meditative tradition, including the community that comes with that, while not directly healing the soul in the moment of most pain, clothes the rawness of the pathos of the moment until we can survive long enough to begin the healing of the heart through those blessings and meditations and community. Those with no ritual tradition or community at all have a radically different challenge when in mourning. That's powerful enough, but less symbolically, this blessing can also be stood at the community level as the responsibility of a holy community or a people who live ethically. A literal hand from heaven might not find clothing for those in a community who have nothing, but an ethical community bound by a narrative of the sanctity of all human life may indeed do this. On the one hand, these daily miracles put into blessing form are how we can understand our daily desires for spiritual elevation, even evolution. On the other hand, and much more critically, they are the tangible signs to look for to understand that things are functioning as they should. When society is not broken, we are free. We can see. We have clothes. We can recognize the beauty of creation, to quote another of these blessings. Our daily needs are taken care of, to quote another. And yes, the captives are free. When these conditions are not met, brokenness has taken the place of goodness, and the God that is manifested in the world is not the God who frees captives. You see, the truth is, miracles happen all the time. When we say something like, that which happened was a 1 in a billion chance, it must have been a miracle, the math may have been correct, but not the understanding of probability. Something with 1,000,000,001 probability, yet repeated infinitely, not just might happen, it will happen. It is simultaneously true that it's beyond all probability that we exist as we are, and as who we are in this moment, and that by virtue of us tangibly being, it's inevitable and therefore quite mundane, which means that our perspective is what's important. Either our life is completely mundane and meaningless, or it's miraculous. Both are equally true. How are we going to look at it? And that's all just a really complicated way of saying that miracles are true and real, but do not, and probably never have, depend on magical hands from heaven. The miracle of a society where there are no captives is based on the mundane work of us humans, all of us humans, that recognize that a society without captives is one closer to a divine image than one that justifies it or celebrates it. There are two meditations that demand to come forth from this painful message. The first is one that we need to carry into the future for ourselves, the naming of the miracles in our lives that we usually just see as mundane. Having clothes, being free, and having our needs taken care of, by way of 3 examples from this passage, are something that has not been a given for the vast majority of moments for people in all of human existence. If we have these things, it may seem mundane, but it is a miracle. Our existence today is much more predicated on complaining than recognizing and experiencing gratitude in that recognition. The second meditation regards the nature of what we imagine to be the universality of daily miracles. Do we wish to, through our intentionality and passion, offer prayerfully or invoke prayerfully a society that functions enough that such things as basic needs are seen as self-evident? Or do we accept in what we give out to the universe for others something that we would never accept for ourselves, or justify for others something that we would never allow to be justified for ourselves? The final truth of miracles is that what we put into the universe tends to come back and hold a mirror to our intentions, and to hold a mirror to the quality of our intentions. The God we pray to is the one that becomes manifest. Now, if only enough of us value a God that frees the captives, but I fear that that's no longer true. Shabbat Shalom.